In this video, we will be looking at the patient table in CPRD database. So in the previous video, we have seen what are the different tables that are there in CPRD database, and we had already a brief introduction to CPRD. Here we will be looking at the only one table, that is patient table. Here we have a small table which contains some essential variables. It may not contain all the variables, but what all are commonly used variables. So we have patient ID, it's called PAT ID, PAT ID, PAT ID, and which is 101 here. Actually the values may be longer in number, there may be many more characters, but here for the sake of simplicity I have kept it as just 3 digit. I just updated the PAT ID to make it little longer in order to give the actual representation of the CPRD PAT ID. Closer value I can say it's, so you can see that PAT ID has several digits here, and here when we derive something called practice ID here, in order to combine this table PAT ID patient table with the practice table. So the last 5 digits in patient ID or PAT ID is what is the practice ID variable. So for example, in this scenario you can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it will be 00001. That will be the practice ID or prac ID, which we derive from the patient table, so that we can combine this table with the practice table. Again, as I mentioned, this PAT ID is a created variable, and I've made it simple by putting zeros and 1. Next we have gender variable. In gender we have 1. 1 represents male. If it is 2, it means female. 3 means unknown. Next is YOP. Is the year of birth, which is 185. And how do we interpret this value as 185? We have to add 1800 to this value to make it the year of birth. For example, in order to find the actual date of birth, we can use this formula, whatever the value of YOB is plus 1800. So you can see that YOB is 185 here, and when we add 1800 or 1800, it will become 1985, which is the year of birth. I can update it to year of birth. That will make better. Next is FRD. You can see FRD is 15th of September 2012. It is the date of the patient when the patient first registered with the practice. When we say practice, it means a clinic, hospital, etc. If it is only temporary records, the patient only has temporary records, then the date is the first encounter with the practice. While if it's a permanent record, it is the date of first permanent record, which means excluding the preceding temporary records. Basically FRD means first registration date with the practice. Then we have CRD. It means current registration date, CRD. Let's assume that the patient started on the practice A and then moved on to practice B and returned back to practice A. So in that scenario, the patient's returning to practice A will be the current registration date. So here in between, the patient had left the practice and returned back to the practice. But if the patient didn't leave the practice, let's say practice A to B did not migrate from practice A to B and stayed back in practice A, then the value of CRD and FRD will be the same. That is, the first registration date and the current registration date will be the same. Next we have the transfer out date. TOD, transfer out date, the date when the patient left the practice. In the previous example I gave, practice A to B, when the patient moves. So it is the date the patient moves from A to B. And we have two reason, transfer out reason, the reason the patient, it could be even death also, the patient moved out of the practice. Then we have the death date, the patient had died. Here we don't have values for, some of the patients do not have values for these variables. So that is the reason we can see that these are left blank. Regstat, REGST8 is the registration status, and accept equal to 1 if it is of if this particular record of this patient is of acceptable standard. In other words, can we use it for research purpose or not? 1 means yes, it's good. So 1 means the patient has met the required quality standards and is acceptable for research purposes. Now we compute the enrollment start date, enrollment end date using the variables from patient and practice tables. So practice table we'll be looking at later on, but coming to the enrollment start date, we will be using FRD, CRD and DB start date. We'll be using these variables to compute the enrollment start date. If FRD and or CRD, any one of them is null, we have missing values, and time out date is not null, the patient left the practice or transferred out of the practice, it's called transfer out date, then we use the DB start date as the enrollment start date. Else we use the greatest of the three values. In other words, if we have FRD, first registration date, current registration date, and these two, both the values are there, then in that case we will be using the greatest or the maximum of these three values as the enrollment start date. Coming to enrollment end date, it requires the variables TOD, death date, LCD and DB end date to compute this variable. Here we will be using the least value, the lowest among all these values as the enrollment end date. One of these variables is called LCD. We already know what is TOD, transfer out date. We know what is death date, and DB end date, it's a database end date. So in enrollment start date, we will be looking at the maximum value of FRD, CRD and DB start date. DB start date is a start date of the current study period basically. For every study, when we do any project or any study, a study has a start date and end date. Let's say 2015 to 2020. So start date is 15 and end date is 2020. So every study will have a study period with a start and end dates. Then we compute the enrollment start date and we use the database start date. Similarly, when we compute the enrollment end date, we use the database end date, which in this example is 2022. And LCD, one variable, is the last collection date that comes from the practice table, the last collection date of the patient data. So LCD is the date of the last collection for the practice. That's all about patient table. The remaining videos will be looking at the other tables. Thank you.